Boucher by Matthew Parker. Henry told the young couple with their thumbs out that he could only take them 25 kilometres or so, but that if they wanted to lift, they were welcome to it. After briefly marvelling at the coincidence of being picked up by an Englishman, Emma and Dan explained to Henry precisely what it was they were doing in the middle of rural France with nothing but their backpacks. We're on our way to Morocco. It's a hitchhiking challenge. The Students' Union organises one every year and we get sponsors to do it, Dan said. Although, to be perfectly honest, it's more for the fun than for the charity, Emma said. Dan thought for a moment, then said, I can't even remember who we're raising money for now that you mention it. It's something to do with children and gardening, Emma told him. Surely that's a bit weird though, said Henry. I mean, I know that we used to do it, all this sort of stuff when I was your age, but I mean, that was way back in the 70s, when nothing bad ever happened to anyone. It seems sort of irresponsible for the university to encourage us students to bowl about foreign countries, picking lifts from strangers. What I'm saying is that, well, for all you know, I could be a serial killer. And in essence, they would have delivered you into my wagon of death. Emma considered pointing out to Henry that he was driving one of those old-fashioned Citroens, which surely must rank as one of the least murdery cars in the world, but decided against it. They drove in silence for a while, 10 kilometres or longer. Dan was the one to break it. So how about you? Me? Asked Henry. Yeah. How about me what? What are you doing here? I live here. I like Brie, I speak passable French. I figured why not, you know? They drove in silence a while longer. This time, Henry broke it. I'm terribly sorry, but I'm going to have to stop for a minute. I have irritable bowel syndrome. Oh my God, that's awful, said Emma. Yeah, it's not great. It can be pretty inconvenient at times. They used to call it a spastic colon. I don't like having a body part, described with a schoolboy insult. It's like finding out your liver's a gaylord or that your tibia's mum's a slag. Henry got out of the car and went to the boot. He opened it and rummaged around for a while, emerging with a loo roll and the sort of plastic shovel mum might use for building sandcastles. He hurried off into the woods. I think we need to leave, Dan said. I'm certain he's going to kill us. Don't be ridiculous, Emma said. He's a bit weird, sure, but he's not a murderer. They debated the point for a couple of minutes. Dan took the view that nobody would say they were going to be a serial killer unless they actually were one. And the only reason only a dangerous sociopath would tell virtual strangers about his bowels for no reason. Emma opined that IBS is not the sort of illness suffered by psychopaths. And besides, it would be terribly rude to leave the car without explanation while Henry was off in the woods, burying his faeces. As an act of compromise, Dan wrote a note. Dear Henry, this feels too much like the start of a slasher movie. Emma does not believe you are to be a serial killer, but I think it's a reasonable chance that you are. Since it's better to be safe than sorry, and I have no desire to see you hacking either one of us to pieces, I'm going to run away from you now, and Emma may be joining me. Dan took off, northwestish, uphill. Emma hesitated a second before remembering that the rules of the competition stated that all teams were required to stick together, regardless of how clearly ridiculous one member was being. She chased him and overtook shortly thereafter. She jogged at a leisurely pace ahead of her panting, sweaty boyfriend, and wondered to herself why on earth she hadn't broken up with him yet. She turned off a narrow path into thicker grass, which she knew would slow him down. The trap had probably been meant for a fox or something. It was one of those big ones with two sets of serrated teeth that snapped together. Emma didn't see it. It clamped down hard on her leg, cutting through her flesh and breaking her bone. Henry would have been in earshot as she cried out, had he not already read Dan's note and driven away. Dan had the feeling he'd heard someone somewhere telling him that although most people in France speak very good English, they get quite snippy when English people don't at least make an effort to speak the lingua franca when in France. Not knowing the word for help, he later learned it was dépanner, he screamed out everything he knew. Bonjour! Bonne nuit! Le chapeau! He cried. He tore up one of his spare t-shirts and tried to ten it into a tourniquet around Emma's leg, with the clumsiness that reminded her of his fumblings in the bedroom. Boulangerie! Ambulance! Voulez-vous coucher avec moi? He cried out, and then realising that ambulance was in the right ballpark, he called out, ambulance! Ambulance! But merci! Ambulance! A Frenchman on a bicycle was cycling on the path from which Emma had deviated 10 minutes prior. He heard Dan calling out and alighted from his ride to investigate further. Later, when retelling the story, Dan would recall how the Frenchman had actually said, "Sacre bleu!" before springing into action. It was not his trap, although he did actually know the local farmer who'd set it. He reapplied the tourniquet, then lifted Emma onto his shoulder with one arm, while lighting a cigarette with the other. "I'm taking you to a doctor," the Frenchman said in barely accented English. Emma, not unreasonably, felt that this might be a good time to pass out. She did so. 3 days later, Emma woke up in a hospital bed. Dan was smiling down at her. "What happened?" she asked. Dan noted her croaky voice and handed her some water. "I don't know how much you remember. You were out of it, I bet. The French chap who found us took us on his bicycle to the local GP's, about 5 miles down the road. It was a spectacular piece of cycling, but that's by the by. You will never guess who the doctor was. Henry! Lovely bloke, as it turns out. He used to work in an emergency room in London. Anyway, to cut a long story short, your leg went all manky, and he had to cut it off while we were waiting for an airlift. Is embolism a thing? Henry said something about embolism. He said that lopping it off was the only option. He seemed pretty sure." Emma itched at the place where her leg should have been, unable to take any of this in. "Dan," she said, "we need to break up." "That is just the painkillers talking." Dan grinned a well-meaning grin. "You know I'd still love you even if you didn't have 2 legs."